After 30 years of devotion, my son allowed his cruel bride to ban me from their wedding. She stood in my home, looked me directly in the eye, and called me completely unimportant. The ultimate betrayal arrived exactly 5 hours later, when the woman who had just erased me from her life demanded I pay her $800 anyway. She thought I would simply comply. She forgot I spent 40 years hunting financial fraud for a living. Jessica Sterling stood in the exact center of my kitchen. She wore a tailored beige coat and held a designer handbag that cost more than my first car. She did not sit down. She did not accept the cup of coffee I offered. She stood on my hardwood floor and delivered the fatal blow with a perfectly practiced smile. She told me the guest list had been trimmed. She used the word trimmed as if she were talking about rose bushes. She said the venue was getting too crowded. She said they needed to prioritize the people who were most vital to their future as a couple. And then, without blinking, she looked me directly in the eye and said I was no longer invited to my own son's wedding. She said it calmly. She said, "Catherine, you have to understand. You are simply completely unimportant to the new family structure David and I are building. Completely unimportant." Those were her exact words. I did not scream. I did not throw the coffee mug. I did not demand to speak to my son. I stood on the opposite side of the kitchen island and I looked at her. I am 64 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a commercial loan underwriter. My entire career was spent assessing risk, identifying financial fraud, and neutralizing threats with paperwork. I have sat across from corporate executives who tried to lie to me about millions of dollars. I know what a liar looks like. I know how a fraud breathes. I know how they stand when they think they have successfully closed a scam. Jessica stood exactly like that. She stood with her weight shifted forward, proud, victorious, assuming I was nothing more than an emotional older woman who would either break down in tears or fly into a blind rage. She wanted a reaction. A reaction would give her a story to tell David. A reaction would allow her to play the victim. I gave her nothing. I gave her silence. I absorbed her insult the way I used to absorb a forged balance sheet. I filed it away. I noted the date, the time, and the exact phrasing. I watched her smile falter just a fraction of an inch when my face did not change. She turned around. She walked out of my front door. She pulled her car out of my driveway, fully believing she had won. She believed she had surgically removed me from my son's life without consequence. The silence in my house was absolute. I walked over to the sink. I poured the coffee down the drain. I rinsed the mug. I dried it with a towel. I put it back in the cabinet. I did not call David. David is my only child. I raised him alone after his father passed away. I paid for his college. I paid for his first car. I helped him buy his first home. I loved him with the steady, quiet devotion of a mother who wanted her son to feel secure in a very uncertain world. But David was not acting like a secure man. He was acting like a coward. A man who allows his future wife to walk into his mother's home and call her unimportant is a man who has surrendered his moral compass. I knew David was aware of this visit. Jessica was bold, but she was not invisible. David knew she was coming, and he stayed perfectly out of sight. 5 hours passed. The afternoon sun moved across the kitchen floor. I sat in my reading chair. I read a book. I did not cry. I waited. In my line of work, you always wait for the other shoe to drop. Fraud is never just about ego. Fraud is always about money. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my phone buzzed on the side table. It was a text message from Jessica. I picked up the phone. The screen illuminated. The message was short, breezy, and entirely devoid of shame. It read, "Hi, Catherine. We just got hit with a last-minute fee for the string quartet. We need $800 by tonight to secure them. Please deposit it into the wedding account right away. Thanks." The bride, who had just banned her mother-in-law from the wedding, was now demanding $800 to pay for the music. She called me unimportant to my face, but my bank account was still incredibly relevant to her future. I stared at the glowing screen. I did not type a response. I did not ask her how she had the nerve to ask me for money. I realized instantly that this was not just a personal insult. This was a calculated financial extraction. She was testing the boundaries of her control. She wanted to see if I was so desperate for my son's love that I would continue to fund a wedding I was banned from attending. She wanted to prove to herself that I was completely broken. She made a catastrophic miscalculation. The text message triggered the next immediate conflict. I set the phone down. I refused to reply. Instead, I stood up. I walked into my home office. I opened my laptop. I sat at my solid oak desk. I turned on the desk lamp. I transformed from a rejected mother into a commercial loan underwriter. The grief vanished. The cold, hard logic of mathematics took its place. Mathematics is clean. Mathematics does not lie. Mathematics does not call you unimportant. I logged into the banking portal. I navigated to the joint wedding account I co-signed with my son David. Over the past 8 months, I had quietly and consistently contributed exactly $45,000 into this account. I funded the venue deposit. I funded the catering deposit. I funded the floral arrangements. I funded the dream wedding Jessica claimed she was building. I opened the transaction history, the screen filled with lines of data. Dates, vendor names, withdrawal amounts, and remaining balances. The underwriter went to work. I started with the most recent demand, $800 for the string quartet. I scrolled down the ledger. I looked at the transactions from 2 weeks ago. My eyes scanned the rows. There it was. An electronic transfer made 14 days prior, payable directly to the classical music agency. The amount was exactly $2,400. The memo line read string quartet payment in full. The string quartet was already paid. It was paid in full. There was no last-minute fee. There was no outstanding balance. Jessica was double billing me. When you find one lie in a ledger, you never stop looking. One lie means the entire foundation is compromised. I adjusted my glasses. I dug deeper. I expanded the search parameters to cover the last 90 days. I exported the data into a fresh spreadsheet. I have analyzed tens of thousands of spreadsheets in my life. I know how to spot the anomalies. I know how to find the money people try to hide. I tracked 3 other unauthorized withdrawals over the last 3 months. They were cleverly disguised. They were labeled with vague descriptions: wedding prep, bridal accessories, vendor consultation fees. But the amounts were too round, too clean, and they did not match any of the signed contracts in my physical master file. The first withdrawal was $1,200. The second was $950. The third was a massive sweeping transfer of $4,000. I cross-referenced the dates and amounts. I matched the routing numbers. The $1,200 payment went to a luxury automotive leasing company. Jessica drove a brand new luxury SUV. She told David her parents bought it as an early wedding gift. Her parents did not buy it. I bought it. She was intercepting the wedding funds to pay for her own personal luxury car lease. I moved to the $4,000 transfer. I traced the destination bank code. It did not belong to a wedding vendor. It belonged to an international wire service. I cross-referenced the date of the transfer with David and Jessica's travel plans. Jessica had been boasting on social media about a surprise, ultra-luxurious secret honeymoon to an exclusive island resort, a trip she claimed she booked using her own savings. She did not use her savings. She funneled my cash into a private offshore account to pay for her secret vacation. She was bleeding the account dry. She was embezzling the money I saved for my son, using it to fund a lifestyle she could not afford. And then she had the audacity to ban me from the very event I was paying for. She thought because I was quiet, I was blind. I sat in my quiet office. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated the dark wood of my desk. I had all the data. I had the complete picture. The narrative was clear. Jessica was a thief and David was either willingly blind or actively complicit. It no longer mattered which one it was. The money was mine and the liability was unacceptable. I made my first silent countermove. I did not call the police. I did not call David. I did not confront Jessica. Confrontation gives the fraudster time to hide their tracks. You do not warn the parasite before you cut off the host. I opened a new browser tab. I logged into the master vendor portal for the luxury botanical estate, where the wedding was scheduled to take place. I am the sole guarantor on that contract. My credit card was securely held on file for all final balances and autopay scheduled transactions. I navigated to the billing section. I clicked on the payment authorization tab. I selected my premium travel rewards card, the card scheduled to be charged $30,000 the week of the wedding. I clicked delete. The system asked me if I was sure I wanted to revoke the autopay authorization. The system warned me that failure to provide an alternative payment method could result in a total cancellation of services. I did not hesitate. I confirmed the deletion. I quietly revoked the payment guarantee for the remaining venue balances. I wiped my financial presence from the vendor portal completely. The dream wedding still had a date, and it still had a location, but it suddenly had absolutely no funding. I closed the laptop. I sat back in my chair. The text message demanding $800 sat unanswered on my desk. Jessica thought I was unimportant. She was about to learn that the most important person in any room is the one who controls the ledger. The wedding was 2 weeks away, and the bride had no idea she had just evicted herself. The Sunday afternoon sun was bright and unforgiving. I parked my car in front of my brother-in-law's house. Thomas Harding is a man who builds things. He is a commercial contractor. He understands the integrity of a physical foundation. He knows that if the concrete is poured wrong, the whole building eventually comes down. Thomas and my late husband were brothers. They shared the same square jaw and the same intolerance for liars. Thomas has always known exactly how much financial power I hold in our family. We operate on the same frequency. We measure people by their actions, not their noise. I walked into his backyard. The smell of charcoal and roasted meat hung in the warm summer air. 50 people were scattered across the manicured lawn. It was a standard summer barbecue in our affluent suburb. Neighbors, extended family members, and local business associates mingled with drinks in their hands. I wore a simple linen dress. I carried a bottle of expensive red wine. I did not look like a woman who had just been banned from her only child's wedding. I did not look like a woman whose bank account was actively being bled dry by a fraudulent bride. I looked completely normal. That is the advantage of being a commercial loan underwriter. You learn how to keep your face perfectly still while the numbers crash around you. Thomas found me within 3 minutes. He did not hug me. He handed me a glass of iced tea and nodded toward the far corner of the stone patio. He told me to walk with him. We walked away from the crowd. We stood near the heavy stone retaining wall he built himself 20 years ago. Thomas took a slow sip of his beer. He looked out over his yard. He did not look at me when he spoke. He delivered the information like a structural damage report, fact-based, direct, and grim. He told me that Brenda Sterling had been parading around the country club all week. Brenda is Jessica's mother. Brenda is a woman who wears too much perfume and speaks at a volume designed to ensure everyone knows she's in the room. She drives a leased Mercedes and carries a counterfeit designer bag. She projects an illusion of wealth that collapses the moment you ask for a receipt. Thomas continued his report. He told me Brenda held court in the main dining room on Thursday. She told 3 different tables of prominent local families that the Sterling family was fully funding the entire botanical estate wedding. She announced that they wanted to give Jessica the fairy tale she deserved. She proclaimed loudly that they were sparing absolutely no expense for their daughter and new son-in-law. I held my glass of iced tea. The condensation dripped onto my hand. I processed the data instantly. The conflict had just shifted. It was no longer just a matter of private theft. It was an active campaign of public humiliation. It was the hostile takeover of a narrative. Brenda Sterling was claiming credit for $45,000 of my money. She was stealing my financial legacy and presenting it to the country club as her own generational wealth. Thomas turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were hard. He reminded me that he knew exactly what the botanical estate cost. He knew Brenda Sterling could not afford the deposit on the cocktail napkins, let alone the premium catering package. He told me she was stealing my credit. I did not argue with him. I did not need to. I simply asked him who Brenda was currently talking to. Thomas pointed his chin toward the center of the yard. He told me to look for myself. I turned my head. I looked across the expanse of green grass. David was standing near the outdoor kitchen. My son, the boy I raised alone, the man whose life I had funded. He was standing right next to Brenda Sterling. Brenda held a glass of white wine. She was talking animatedly to Judge Harrison, one of the most prominent and wealthy men in our community. I watched Brenda's mouth move. I watched her point to David. I watched her make grand sweeping gestures toward the sky. I knew exactly what she was saying. She was repeating the lie. She was cementing the false narrative to a man who commands absolute respect in our town. I did not focus on Brenda. I focused entirely on David. I watched his face. I waited for him to correct her. I waited for him to step in to politely clarify that his mother was actually the sole financial sponsor of the entire event. I waited for the moral compass I spent 2 decades calibrating to finally point true north. David did not correct her. He nodded. He smiled a tight, uncomfortable smile. He took a sip of his drink and he said absolutely nothing. He allowed the lie to stand. That single nod was the most expensive movement my son ever made. In that silent, cowardly motion, his complicity was cemented in real time. The betrayal deepened instantly. It fractured the bedrock of our relationship. This was no longer just about a greedy bride manipulating a passive groom. This was about a son actively participating in the complete erasure of his own mother. He was allowing Brenda to strip me of my contribution, my dignity, and my place in the community just to keep the peace with his fiancée. He chose the path of least resistance. He chose their comfort over my existence. Thomas watched the exact same interaction. He sighed heavily. It was the sound of a man watching a poorly constructed roof cave in. He told me he was sorry. He said the boy had lost his spine. I turned away from the yard. I looked at the stone wall. I did not feel angry. I felt incredibly clear. The audit was complete. The liability was fully assessed. I thanked Thomas. I told him the spine can be lost, but the ledger always balances in the end. I put my untouched iced tea on the retaining wall. I walked back through the crowd. I did not say goodbye to David. He was already gone. I left the barbecue immediately. I drove home in absolute silence. The radio remained off. My mind was a calculating engine, sorting the variables, weighing the legal parameters, and mapping the exact sequence of events required to liquidate the Sterling family's stolen pride. I parked in my garage. I walked directly into my home office. I did not pause to change out of my dress. The time for waiting had expired. I opened the heavy steel door of my floor safe. I reached past the insurance policies and the property deeds. I pulled out the thick red master vendor folder. I placed it on the center of my desk. I opened it flat. The smell of fresh ink and premium paper filled the space. I sat down and I began to review the precise legal text of the contracts. In commercial underwriting, the fine print is the only print that matters. People lie. Handshakes fail. Promises evaporate. Contracts remain. I read every single master agreement line by line. The luxury botanical estate venue. The high-end catering package featuring prime rib and imported seafood. The bespoke floral design contract detailing thousands of white orchids. I traced my finger over the signature blocks. Every single document was signed exclusively by Catherine Harding. The billing address was my home. The funding source was my account. I looked for the names Jessica Sterling, Brenda Sterling, or David Harding. They did not exist on these pages. Legally, they were ghosts. They were merely guests at a party I owned. The Sterlings held absolutely no legal standing. They had no authority to alter, cancel, or dictate the terms of these agreements. They had claimed public ownership of an empire built entirely on my signature. My first instinct was to simply cancel everything. I could pick up the phone, terminate the agreements, and demand a refund. But I am an underwriter, and I understand the penalty of early withdrawal. Canceling was too simple. Canceling would yield only a partial refund due to the breach clauses. I would lose 30% of the $50,000 I had already committed. I would suffer a financial penalty for their fraud. More importantly, canceling would just leave a void. It would leave the venue empty. Jessica could easily spin a cancellation into a story about my malicious instability. She could claim I ruined her wedding out of pure spite. I do not operate on spite. I operate on maximum leverage. I turned to page 9 of the Botanical Estate Master Contract. I found the transferability clause. Clause 4.2. It stated that the primary contract holder retained the right to alter the nature of the event, the guest list, and the designated beneficiary of the services provided up to 14 days prior to the reserved date. The wedding was exactly 14 days away. The window was closing, but it was still open. I reached for my desk phone. I dialed the direct number for the venue director. Her name was Victoria, a sharp, efficient woman who had managed high-profile events for 20 years. She answered on the second ring. I spoke in the calm, measured tone of a woman authorizing a standard corporate asset transfer. I told Victoria I was calling regarding the contract for the estate reservation in 2 weeks. Victoria was bright and professional. She confirmed that everything was on schedule. She said they were finalizing the lighting grid tomorrow. She asked how she could help me. I told her I needed to execute a complete transfer of the event purpose and the beneficiary under clause 4.2. I stated clearly that the date remains the same. The catering package remains the same. The floral arrangements remain exactly as ordered. However, I informed her this was no longer a wedding. I instructed her to transfer the entire reservation to the local children's hospital for their annual charity gala. There was a silence on the line. It was not a confused silence. It was the stunned silence of a professional realizing she was standing in the blast radius of a massive detonation. Victoria cleared her throat. She asked to confirm that I was entirely removing the wedding party from the reservation. I confirmed it. I explained that I have sponsored the Pediatric Foundation for a decade. I knew they were always looking for premium venues for their fundraising efforts. I stated I was donating the estate, the food, and the flowers to the hospital. I reminded her the contract was in my name and the funds were mine. I demanded the documents be amended immediately to reflect the Children's Hospital as the sole beneficiary of the event. Victoria did not ask questions. She did not ask about my son. She did not ask about the bride. She checked the contract. She verified my legal standing. She saw the math. She told me the contract allows for this action. She agreed to generate the amendment right then and there. She confirmed the deposit and all applied payments would be locked in under the charity's name. By these costs, I stayed on the line while she drafted the paperwork. 5 minutes later, an email arrived in my inbox. I opened the digital document. I read the amended terms. The botanical estate, the prime rib, the white orchids, and the grand ballroom were now legally bound to a pediatric fundraiser. I applied my digital signature. I hit send. The transfer was complete. The legal trap was locked. I leaned back in my chair. I looked at the red folder on my desk. Jessica's dream wedding venue now legally belonged to a charity for sick children. The catering she selected would feed wealthy donors writing checks for medical research. The flowers she demanded would decorate tables, raising money for pediatric care. And the bride was completely unaware. Jessica and Brenda were still parading around the country club, boasting about their boundless wealth and their perfect planning. They were inviting people to a property they had no right to enter. They were bragging about a party that no longer existed. I did not just stop the wedding, I repurposed it. I took my unimportant money and gave it to a cause that actually mattered. I turned the desk lamp off. I sat in the dim light of my office. The campaign of erasure had been met with a complete and legal eviction. The phone on my desk rang 2 days after I transferred the venue. The caller identification displayed my son's name. I let it ring 3 times. In the world of finance, the person who speaks first usually loses the negotiation. I picked up the receiver on the 4th ring. I pressed it to my ear. I expected an apology. Any mother would expect an apology. I anticipated the sound of a son who had finally realized the gravity of his cowardice. I thought the echoes of his silence at the barbecue might have kept him awake. I thought he was calling to rebuild the bridge he allowed his bride to burn. The narrative of a hopeful mother pivoted sharply into the reality of a greedy son. David did not apologize. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not mention the barbecue or Brenda Sterling's lies. His voice was tight, rushed, and perfectly rehearsed. He sounded exactly like a man reading from a script written by someone else. He said hello, and then he immediately asked for a favor. He asked for the Harding family heirloom. My breathing slowed. The Harding family heirloom is a vintage diamond necklace. It features 3 carats of flawless, brilliant cut diamonds set in antique platinum. It was given to me by my late husband on our 10th wedding anniversary. Its appraised value is $30,000. It is not just a piece of jewelry. It is a generational asset. It represents the permanence and the legacy of a family that builds things to last. David told me Jessica needed the necklace. He used the word need as if it were a medical emergency. He said her custom gown had a plunging neckline, and the designer insisted the antique diamonds were the only pieces that could properly balance the silhouette. He spoke about silhouettes and necklines, as if those things justified the extortion of a banished mother. I listened to him speak. I let the silence stretch over the phone line. David grew uncomfortable. He rushed to fill the quiet. That is when he made the ultimate error. He casually mentioned the logistics of the transfer. He told me I did not even need to see Jessica to drop it off. He said I could just drive to Jessica's apartment, hand the $30,000 necklace to her maid, and drive home. He told me to drop off my family legacy at the back door of a woman who had barred me from the front door of my own son's wedding. He reinforced the reality that I was still completely banned from the actual property. He wanted my wealth, but he absolutely refused to tolerate my presence. The last remaining thread of my maternal leniency snapped. I realized in that exact moment that David was entirely managed by his bride. He was a hollow vessel. He was willing to strip his mother of her generational assets while simultaneously excluding her from the family structure. He was acting as a delivery boy for a fraud. I did not yell at him. I did not cry into the receiver. I underwrote his character right there on the phone, and I found him completely bankrupt. I agreed to bring the necklace. David let out a loud, audible sigh of relief. He started to thank me, but I cut him off. I dictated the terms of the transaction. I told him I would not be handing a $30,000 heirloom to a maid. I told him I would hand it over personally. I stated I would deliver it at the rehearsal dinner on Friday night. David panicked. His voice spiked an octave. He stammered. He said the rehearsal dinner was a very tight, closed event. He said Jessica had carefully arranged the seating chart. He scrambled to find an excuse to keep me out of the room. He told me it would be too awkward. He said the venue was fully booked and the catering was already locked in. He was essentially telling his own mother that there was no physical space for her in his life, but there was plenty of space for her money and her jewelry. I listened to him construct these pathetic barriers. I let him tire himself out with excuses. Then I kept my voice perfectly level. I applied the pressure. I told him those were my terms. I said I deliver the diamonds directly to the bride at the rehearsal dinner, or the bride walks down the aisle wearing nothing but her own arrogance. I reminded him that I own the necklace, and I decide exactly who wears it. I gave him exactly 5 seconds to decide. He folded. He agreed to my terms. He told me the time and the location of the private country club. He traded his fiancée's boundaries for a piece of jewelry. I hung up the phone. I had successfully forced my way into the final pre-wedding event. The door was open, and I was going to walk through it with a sledgehammer. I sat at my desk and looked at the black screen of my phone. I realized how easy it was for David to betray me when he thought there was a financial reward attached to it. He traded my dignity for Jessica's vanity. He did not care that I would be walking into a room full of people who had been told I was a selfish, unimportant woman. He only cared about securing the diamonds. He only cared about following Jessica's orders. This was the final piece of evidence I needed. The emotional audit was completely finished. My son was no longer a victim of a manipulative woman. He was a willing participant in her scheme. He was an accessory to the theft of my legacy. The grief I felt earlier in the week hardened into something much more useful. It hardened into absolute resolve. I spent the next 2 days meticulously preparing my evidence. I approached the task with the exact same discipline I used when I prepared packages for federal bank examiners. You do not bring emotions to an audit. You bring receipts. You bring timestamps. You bring undeniable proof. I started in my home office. The printer hummed steadily in the quiet room. I printed the joint bank account statements first. I highlighted the 4 unauthorized withdrawals in a bright neon yellow marker. I printed the invoice from the classical music agency clearly showing the string quartet had been paid in full weeks before Jessica demanded the $800 from me. I placed the fraudulent text message printout right next to the paid invoice. The contradiction was stark and undeniable. Next, I printed the legally amended venue contract. The document was beautiful. The heavy black ink spelled out the transfer to the children's hospital. It detailed the donation of the prime rib, the white orchids, and the grand ballroom. It featured my digital signature, authorizing the total eviction of the Sterling family from the botanical estate. I printed the email confirmation from Victoria, the venue director, verifying that the lockout was fully processed. The paper trail was flawless. Every single financial move Jessica made in the shadows was now documented in harsh black and white ink. I took all of these documents and placed them inside a thick leather-bound financial portfolio. It was the same portfolio I used to carry when I walked into boardrooms to deny $50 million commercial loans. The leather was worn at the edges, but it commanded immediate respect. It felt heavy in my hands. It felt like justice. The paperwork was only half of the preparation. I still had to address the family heirloom. On Thursday morning, I drove to the main branch of my bank downtown. The air in the vault was cool and smelled of polished steel and old paper. The bank manager left me alone in the private viewing room. I opened my safe deposit box. Inside rested a velvet box containing the authentic Harding family diamond necklace. The real stones caught the dim light and threw sharp, brilliant colors across the room. They were flawless. They were heavy. They belonged to a family that understood loyalty. Right next to the authentic necklace sat a second velvet box. 10 years ago, my husband and I took a long cruise through Europe. For security reasons, I had a master jeweler create an exact high-quality replica of the heirloom using premium cubic zirconia and rhodium-plated silver. To the untrained eye, the replica is absolutely identical to the real piece. It shines with the same brilliance. It carries the same weight. It possesses the same antique silhouette. But under a jeweler's loupe, the truth is obvious. It is a manufactured fake. It holds no real value. I opened both boxes. I looked at the genuine diamonds forged under immense pressure over millions of years. Then I looked at the synthetic stones created quickly in a laboratory to simply look the part. The metaphor was too perfect to ignore. Jessica Sterling was a synthetic bride. She was a woman who manufactured an illusion of wealth, an illusion of class, and an illusion of love. She wanted the status of the Harding family without doing the actual work of being part of it. She wanted the shine without the substance. I took the authentic diamond necklace and secured it deeply within the back of the safe deposit box. I locked it away where Jessica's greedy hands would never reach it. Then I picked up the high-quality cubic zirconia replicas. I placed the fake diamonds inside a pristine dark blue velvet presentation box. I snapped the lid shut. I walked out of the bank vault with the blue velvet box in my purse. The air outside was warm, but I felt entirely cold and focused. I drove back to my house. I placed the velvet box on my desk, right on top of the thick leather-bound financial portfolio. I looked at the arrangement on my desk. The portfolio contained the absolute documentation of financial ruin. The velvet box contained a literal, fake jewel meant for a fake bride. I had everything I needed. The trap was fully constructed. The bait was in place. The snare was set. All I had to do now was walk into that rehearsal dinner and watch the architects of my erasure step directly onto the trigger. The rehearsal dinner took place on a Friday evening at the most exclusive private country club in our district. The building was a massive colonial structure with white pillars and a sprawling valley driveway. The air was crisp. The evening was perfectly clear. I arrived at exactly 7 o'clock. I did not drive myself. Thomas Harding drove his heavy-duty commercial truck right up to the main entrance. He handed his keys to a valet, who looked terrified of the vehicle. Thomas walked around the truck and opened my door. He offered me his arm. I took it. I wore a tailored dark navy suit. I carried the heavy leather financial portfolio in my left hand. I carried the dark blue velvet box in my purse. I did not look like a woman attending a celebration. I looked like a woman arriving to execute a foreclosure. We walked up the wide brick steps. We passed through the double mahogany front doors. The club manager tried to ask for our names. Thomas simply looked at him. The manager stepped aside. We walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the private dining rooms. I could hear the noise long before I saw the guests. The sound of clinking wine glasses and loud laughter spilled out into the corridor. It was the sound of people spending money they did not earn. We reached the entrance of the main banquet room. I stood in the doorway and observed the scene. It was a beautiful setup. The room featured crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the golf course. 50 guests were seated at a massive long table covered in heavy white linen. The floral centerpieces were extravagant. The wine was flowing freely. The Sterling family was holding court. They completely dominated the physical space in the room. Jessica sat near the center of the table. She wore a white silk dress. She was glowing with the specific kind of confidence that comes from successful theft. David sat quietly next to her. He looked small. At the head of the table stood Brenda Sterling. Brenda held a glass of champagne high in the air. She was in the middle of a loud, boastful toast. Her voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. She commanded the attention of all 50 guests. I stood perfectly still in the doorway and listened to her speak. Brenda told the room how blessed the Sterling family was to be able to provide such a magnificent weekend for the young couple. She spoke about generosity. She talked about the importance of giving your children the absolute best start in life. She bragged about the luxury botanical estate they had secured for tomorrow. She mentioned the prime rib. She mentioned the white orchids. She looked at her country club friends and proclaimed that true wealth is about sharing your blessings with the people who matter most. She used the exact phrase her daughter had used in my kitchen. The people who matter most. I did not wait for her to finish her toast. I did not wait for the applause. I stepped into the dining room. Thomas Harding walked firmly at my side. My low-heeled shoes clicked against the hardwood floor surrounding the large dining carpet. The sound was sharp. It was rhythmic. A guest seated near the door noticed me first. He lowered his fork. The woman next to him turned her head. The silence started at the back of the room and moved forward like a wave. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The laughter died completely. The clinking of silverware ceased. Brenda Sterling stopped speaking. She froze with her champagne glass suspended in the air. The room went completely dead silent. The silence was absolute and suffocating. I walked the entire length of the long table. 50 pairs of eyes tracked my movement. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. I kept my posture perfectly straight. I did not look at the guests. I did not look at Brenda. I looked exclusively at my son. I reached the head of the table. There was no chair set for me. Thomas Harding reached over and grabbed a heavy wooden chair from an empty side table. He dragged it across the floor. The wood scraped loudly against the polish. He placed the chair directly at the head of the table, right next to Brenda Sterling. He stood behind it. I sat down. I placed my purse on the floor. David turned completely pale. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He knew exactly what the presence of Thomas Harding meant. He knew the bridge was gone. Jessica did not turn pale. Jessica turned bright red. Her manufactured grace evaporated instantly. She slammed her hands down on the white linen tablecloth. She stood up so fast her chair almost tipped backward. She pointed her finger at me. She raised her voice and ordered me to leave. She demanded to know who let me in. She looked at the club waitstaff and frantically demanded that Catherine be removed by security immediately. She yelled that this was a private event and I was an uninvited guest. I ignored her entirely. I did not even turn my head to look at her. A commercial loan underwriter never engages with a screaming debtor. You let them exhaust their panic. I reached down and picked up the heavy leather portfolio. I lifted it high enough for every single person in the room to see it. I placed it directly on the center of the table. The thick leather hit the wood with a heavy, resounding thud. It sounded like a judge bringing down a gavel. Jessica stopped screaming. Brenda lowered her champagne glass. David closed his eyes. The room waited. I unzipped the leather portfolio. The sound of the metal zipper was the only noise in the banquet room. I folded the cover back. I looked down the table. I made eye contact with David. Then I made eye contact with Jessica. Finally, I looked up at Brenda Sterling. I spoke in a measured, authoritative tone that cut clearly through the tension in the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth is heavy enough to carry itself. I reached into the portfolio. I pulled out the printed text message. I held it up. I told the room that 5 days ago, Jessica Sterling stood in my kitchen and banned me from this wedding. I told them she looked me in the eye and called me completely unimportant. Then I read the text message out loud. I read her exact words demanding $800 for a string quartet on the very same day she erased me from the family. I passed the printed text message to the man sitting on my left. I told him to pass it down the table. Jessica opened her mouth to speak. I did not let her. I reached back into the portfolio. I pulled out the stack of highlighted bank statements. I told the room that the string quartet was paid in full 2 weeks prior. I announced that the bride was double billing the mother of the groom. I held up the bank statements. I pointed to the bright yellow highlights. I stated exactly where the money had gone. I told the 50 guests about the $1,200 payment for her luxury car lease. I told them about the offshore wire transfer for a secret tropical honeymoon. I proved her embezzlement to the entire bridal party right there over the dinner plates. I handed the bank statements to the woman on my right. I told her to pass them down the table. The guests began reading the numbers. Whispers broke out. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I turned my head. I looked directly at Brenda Sterling. She was still standing perfectly still. Her face was frozen in a mask of total shock. I dismantled her lie immediately. I told the room that I had listened to Brenda boast about funding this wedding. I raised my voice just enough to ensure the people at the back could hear the mathematics. I revealed the exact dollar amounts. I stated that I paid the $12,000 venue deposit. I stated that I paid the $18,000 catering bill. I stated that I paid the $15,000 floral invoice. I told Brenda she did not fund a fairy tale. I told Brenda she stole my credit because her own bank account was empty. Brenda sat down heavily in her chair. She could not look at her friends. I reached into my purse. I pulled out the dark blue velvet box. I placed it on the white tablecloth next to the portfolio. I placed my hand on top of it. I looked at David. I told him that he had called me and asked for the $30,000 Harding family heirloom. I told him he wanted me to hand my legacy over to a maid so his bride could wear my wealth while banning me from the property. I slid the velvet box down the table. It stopped directly in front of Jessica. I told her to open it. She hesitated. The entire room watched her. Her hands were shaking. She reached out and popped the lid open. The heavy, brilliant stones caught the light of the chandeliers. Gasps echoed from the bridal party. I looked at Jessica. I announced to the room that I had brought the family heirloom exactly as requested. But I noted that I had visited my safe deposit box before arriving. I told her the stones in that box were high-quality synthetic cubic zirconia. I locked eyes with the bride. I told her that real diamonds belong to a family that respects loyalty. I told her that fake diamonds belong on a fraud. Jessica screamed. It was a loud, piercing sound of total humiliation. She shoved the velvet box away from her. The synthetic diamonds spilled out onto the table. David finally stood up. His face was a mixture of shame and panic. He tried to defend his bride. He put his hands on the table and yelled at me. He asked me how I could do this to them on the night before their wedding. He said I was ruining everything. I looked at my son. I felt no pity. I delivered the final blow. I informed the room that a bank does not fund a fraudulent enterprise once the audit is complete. I announced clearly and firmly that I had officially withdrawn my financial guarantee for the entire weekend. I stated that my credit cards were removed and my funding was terminated. I intentionally left out the detail about the legal venue transfer to the Children's Hospital. I wanted them to discover that particular consequence on their own time. I closed my empty leather portfolio. I zipped it shut. I stood up. Thomas Harding stepped back to clear my path. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on 50 silent guests. I walked out of the banquet room with the exact same steady pace I used to walk in. I walked down the long carpeted hallway and out the double mahogany doors. I left the Sterling family in absolute chaos over the white linen tablecloths. The financial eviction was complete. I was not at the luxury botanical estate on Saturday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking a cup of dark roast coffee. I did not need to be on the property to see the collapse. The venue security logs the local police dispatch reports, and the tearful admissions from the groomsmen provided every single detail of the morning. The climax of Jessica Sterling's manufactured fairy tale hit with the cinematic force of a high-speed collision. The morning of the wedding arrived with clear blue skies and bright sunshine. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, a massive stretch limousine pulled off the main highway and turned onto the private oak-lined driveway of the botanical estate. Inside the rented vehicle sat Jessica, David Brenda Sterling, and the entire bridal party. They were dressed in heavy formal wear. They were drinking expensive champagne. They were completely oblivious to the financial eviction that had taken place the night before. Jessica wore the custom silk wedding gown she bought with embezzled funds. David wore a tailored black tuxedo. They expected the driveway to be lined with welcoming staff holding silver trays. They expected a seamless transition into their stolen luxury. Instead, the limousine came to a sudden, jerking halt. The driver rolled down the privacy partition and informed the wedding party that they could not proceed. Jessica and David stepped out of the air-conditioned vehicle into the summer heat. They found the massive wrought iron gates of the estate locked tight with a heavy steel chain. Two armed security guards wearing crisp white shirts and black tactical vests stood firmly on the other side of the metal bars. The guards held clipboards. They were actively turning away early arriving guests and confused vendors. They held their hands up in a universal gesture of denial. David approached the gates first. He tried to use his charm. He told the guards there was a simple misunderstanding. He announced that he was the groom and the woman in the white dress was the bride. The guards did not smile. They did not apologize. They looked at their clipboards and stated clearly that there was no wedding scheduled for that day. They informed David that the entire property was closed for a private charitable function. Jessica pushed past David. She gripped the cold iron bars with both hands. She looked through the gates and saw the sprawling front lawns of the estate. The property was a hive of intense activity, but it was not her activity. Dozens of event staff were rushing across the manicured grass. They were erecting massive white canvas tents. They were setting up silent auction tables. Through the open doors of the grand ballroom, Jessica could see the exact floral arrangements I had paid for. Thousands of white orchids were being placed on the centerpieces. The catering staff was carrying massive silver trays of prime rib and imported seafood toward the buffet stations. It was the exact wedding she had designed. It was the exact food she had chosen. It was the exact floral package she had demanded. But hanging high above the grand entrance was a massive vinyl banner. The banner read, "The 10th Annual Children's Hospital Pediatric Research Gala." Jessica lost her mind. The illusion of class vanished instantly. She rattled the heavy iron gates and screamed at the security guards. She demanded they open the locks immediately. She yelled that she was Jessica Sterling, and this was her wedding day. She ordered the staff to stop touching her flowers. She pointed her manicured fingers through the bars and threatened to sue every single person on the property. Her screams echoed down the long oak driveway, sharp and desperate, ruining the quiet elegance of the estate. The commotion drew the attention of the main office. Victoria, the venue director, walked out of the administrative building. Victoria was a woman who dealt with high-stress corporate events on a daily basis. A screaming bride did not intimidate her. She walked down the long driveway with perfect posture. She approached the iron gates. She held a thick manila folder in her hands. Jessica saw Victoria and immediately demanded access. She yelled that someone had made a catastrophic administrative error. She demanded that Victoria fire the security guards and open the gates for the bride. Victoria did not open the gates. She did not apologize. She stood safely behind the iron bars and opened her manila folder. She presented the legally amended contract. She held it up so Jessica and David could see the thick black ink. Victoria spoke in a calm, professional voice that cut through the hysteria. She informed them that there was absolutely no error. She explained that the sole contract holder, Catherine Harding, had legally executed a transfer of rights under Clause 4.2 of the Master Agreement. Victoria stated clearly that Catherine's name was the only authorized signature on the document. She informed the bride that the venue, the prime rib, the white orchids, and the ballroom were now the legal property of the Children's Hospital. David stared at the contract. He recognized my digital signature. He finally understood the magnitude of the snare. He realized I did not just cancel the funding. I repurposed the entire event to ensure they could not salvage it. Jessica refused to accept reality. She began striking the iron gates with her fists. She screamed that the contract was fraudulent. She tried to climb the lower rung of the wrought iron fence. Her custom silk gown caught on a piece of metal and tore near the hem. She was completely out of control, acting like a trespasser rather than a lady of high society. Victoria did not argue with a trespasser. She simply pulled a two-way radio from her belt and contacted the local authorities. Within 10 minutes, the flashing blue and red lights of 2 police cruisers reflected off the iron gates. 4 uniformed police officers stepped out of their vehicles. They did not care about the silk dress or the bridal party. They cared about the law. The lead officer spoke with Victoria, reviewed the amended contract, and turned to the wedding party. He placed his hand on his utility belt and issued a direct, uncompromising order. The officer informed Jessica that she held no legal right to be beyond the premises. He told her she was causing a public disturbance and interfering with a legally contracted charity event. He pointed a stern finger toward the busy state highway at the end of the driveway. He gave her exactly 3 minutes to get back into the rented limousine and leave the property. He stated in a loud, clear voice that if she touched the iron gates one more time, she would be placed in handcuffs and formally charged with criminal trespassing. David stood frozen in his black tuxedo, completely stripped of his dignity and his assumed inheritance. He realized he had traded a mother who loved him for a bride who was currently screaming at a police officer over a gate she did not own. Brenda Sterling covered her face with her hands, desperately trying to hide from the passing cars on the highway, knowing her entire country club facade was currently dying on the asphalt. The ultimate humiliation was complete. Jessica Sterling, the woman who told me I was completely unimportant to her future, stood crying on the dusty gravel shoulder of a state highway. She was wearing a torn wedding dress, surrounded by police officers, and legally barred from a party she tried to steal. The police cruisers slowly drove away, leaving the wedding party standing in the dust of the state highway shoulder. But the nightmare for the Sterling family was only just beginning. At exactly 10:30 in the morning, the first wave of guests began to arrive. Luxury sedans, imported sports cars, and chauffeured town cars turned off the main road and funneled into the gravel staging area directly in front of the locked iron gates. 150 guests arrived to attend a lavish estate wedding. They stepped out of their air-conditioned vehicles wearing expensive summer suits, tailored tuxedos, and floor-length silk dresses. They adjusted their ties. They checked their watches. Then they looked at the heavy steel chains securing the main entrance. They looked at the massive vinyl banner announcing the pediatric charity gala hanging over the gates. Then they looked at the bride standing in the dirt with a torn dress and ruined makeup. The confusion was immediate and palpable. The fallout was immediate, brutal, and entirely public. Brenda Sterling was forced to stand in the center of the gravel parking lot and face the exact people she had lied to all week. Judge Harrison stepped out of his silver luxury sedan. He walked up to Brenda and asked why the gates were closed to the Sterling family wedding. Brenda opened her mouth, but the lies finally failed her. She had no money to bribe the guards. She had no authority to open the gates. She had absolutely no explanation that would preserve her dignity. The high society friends she had desperately tried to impress watched her face crumble. They realized they were standing on the side of a highway for an event that did not exist. The whispers started immediately. The country club elite do not shout. They simply judge you and turn their backs. Brenda watched her social standing evaporate into the hot morning air. She was completely ruined in the exact circles she tried to conquer. While Brenda was drowning in social humiliation, the financial reality descended on David. The day of the wedding is when the final vendor balances are traditionally collected. The independent contractors began arriving. The lead photographer, the cinematic videography team, the specialty wedding cake delivery driver, and the premium string quartet pulled their vehicles onto the gravel shoulder. They walked past the confused guests. They bypassed Brenda. They walked directly up to David and Jessica. The lead photographer held a digital tablet displaying an unpaid invoice. He informed David that the primary credit card on file belonging to Catherine Harding had been completely deactivated the night before. He stated that the final day of service payment of $3,500 was required immediately before a single camera would be unpacked. The cinematic videography team echoed the demand, holding a contract for $2,000. The premium string quartet manager presented an agreement demanding their remaining balance of $1,200 in cash. The specialty wedding cake delivery driver stood behind them, refusing to unload a 5-tier custom cake without a final payment of $800. The vendors completely surrounded the groom. They did not care about the locked gates. They did not care about the crying mother of the bride. They cared about their invoices. They demanded cash immediately, and they threatened immediate breach of contract lawsuits right there on the highway. David panicked. He pulled his mobile phone from his tuxedo pocket. His hands shook as he opened his banking application. He intended to transfer funds from his personal savings account to cover the furious vendors. David is a grown man, a person who should understand basic security, but he had completely neglected the financial security of his own life. He logged into his account. The screen loaded. The balance displayed on his screen was a single digit. He tapped the transaction history frantically. The ledger revealed a terrifying truth. Over the past 48 hours, Jessica had systematically and ruthlessly drained his personal savings. She had executed dozens of rapid electronic transfers. David cross-referenced the destination accounts while his hands trembled. Jessica had used his entire life savings to aggressively pay off her own hidden high-interest credit cards. She had maximized her own personal debt for months to secretly fund her designer wardrobe, her luxury car lease down payment, and her private offshore accounts. Then she used his money to clear her name just before the wedding ceremony. David stared at the glowing screen. The math was undeniable. The numbers stared back at him with absolute cruelty. He was exactly $40,000 in debt. His savings were completely gone. His checking account was overdrawn. He had no venue. He had no catering. He had no wedding to show for any of it. He was financially ruined. David looked up from his phone. He looked at the woman he was supposed to marry. He asked her where his money went. He asked her how she could drain his accounts while standing in the dirt outside a locked gate. That is the exact moment Jessica Sterling's true colors finally emerged. The manufactured grace completely disappeared. The mask fell off and shattered on the asphalt. She did not apologize. She did not express remorse for stealing his savings. Instead, she turned on him with absolute venom. She screamed at the top of her lungs in front of the vendors, the guests, and the remaining country club elites. She called David pathetic. She screamed about his uselessness. She pointed her finger at his chest and blamed him for the entire disaster. She yelled that a real man would have controlled his mother. She shrieked that if he had just managed me properly, they would be inside the grand ballroom drinking champagne instead of standing in a gravel parking lot begging photographers for mercy. She exposed her entire character to the crowd. She proved that she never loved David. She only loved the financial utility he provided. When the utility ran dry, her affection vanished instantly. David stood in his expensive tuxedo and absorbed her verbal assault. The 150 guests watched the entire spectacle. They watched a groom realize his entire life was a manufactured lie. He looked at the screaming woman in the torn white dress. He looked at her mother sobbing near a luxury sedan while the country club elites drove away in disgust. He looked at the massive iron gates protecting the charity gala my money was currently funding. He finally realized exactly what he had traded his mother for. He had traded 30 years of quiet, steady devotion for a parasite that loudly discarded him the absolute moment the host account ran dry. David did not scream back. He did not defend himself. He simply turned around. He walked away from Jessica. He walked away from the furious vendors holding their unpaid invoices. He walked away from the crowd of whispering guests and the ruined Sterling family. He walked down the shoulder of the state highway completely alone. The relationship did not end with a formal conversation or a tearful goodbye. It shattered right there on the hot asphalt, crushed under the absolute weight of a zero-balance bank account and an undeniable truth. 3 months passed. The dust finally settled over our affluent suburb. The relentless summer heat broke and gave way to the crisp, unforgiving air of early autumn. My house was quiet. The garden I tended began to sleep for the winter. The money I had saved for 10 years remained securely in my accounts, earning compound interest instead of funding a fraudulent wedding. During those 90 days, I did not receive a single phone call from my son. I did not reach out. I allowed him to sit in the absolute silence of his own consequences. The Tuesday afternoon light stretched across my hardwood floor, steady and reliable. At exactly 2 o'clock, a car pulled into my driveway. It was David. He drove a modest used sedan. He must have financed it on his own after his savings were entirely decimated by the woman he chose over me. He parked near the garage. He stepped out of the vehicle. He looked entirely alone. He did not walk with the arrogant stride he carried at the Sunday barbecue. He walked like a man carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of a $40,000 debt and a completely shattered ego. He looked exhausted. He looked defeated. The engagement was officially broken on the exact day of the locked gate. Jessica abandoned him on the gravel shoulder of the highway, the absolute moment the cash ran out, and he had spent the last 3 months living in the financial and emotional wreckage she left behind. He walked up to the front door. He did not use his key. He knocked. The knock was hesitant and weak. It was the sound of a person asking for permission to enter a space they used to own unconditionally. I opened the door. I did not smile. I stepped aside. He walked into the foyer and moved slowly toward the kitchen. He sat down at the heavy oak table. He sat in the exact same chair where Jessica once sat to tell me I was completely unimportant. I stood on the opposite side of the kitchen island. I looked at my son. His clothes were wrinkled. His posture was slumped. He looked up at me and he attempted an apology. The words fell out of his mouth in a disorganized rush. He said he was sorry. He tried to shift the blame entirely onto his bride. He said Jessica manipulated him. He said she spun a web of lies and he was too blind to see it. He said he never should have let her speak to me that way, but his voice sounded incredibly hollow. It sounded like a man apologizing because he had run out of options, not because he had suddenly grown a moral compass. He was looking for an escape route. He was looking for a mother to reach across the table, hold his hands, and tell him everything would be completely fine. He was waiting for me to pull out my checkbook and erase his pain. I did not reach across the table. I did not offer him a warm hug. I did not offer him an easy resolution. I am a retired commercial loan underwriter. When an account defaults due to gross negligence, you do not coddle the borrower. You assess the damage, and you set ironclad terms for any future interaction. I looked at David with the exact same objective clarity I used to look at a bankrupt corporate ledger. I spoke in a calm, measured tone. I told him that an apology without restitution is just meaningless noise. I explained that he did not just make a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to call on a birthday. A mistake is a missed appointment. What he did was a calculated betrayal. I told him that respect is the primary currency of any functional family. I informed him that his account was entirely overdrawn. I looked him directly in the eye and told him he was currently morally bankrupt. He allowed a greedy woman to strip me of my dignity, attempt to erase my legacy and steal my financial assets while he stood silently by holding a glass of wine. I told him cowardice is the most expensive character flaw a man can possess, and he was currently paying the maximum price for it. David lowered his head. He looked at his hands resting on the wood table. He asked me if I hated him. I told him I could never hate him. I told him I am his mother, and I will always love him. I walked over to the coffee maker. I poured a cup of dark roast coffee. I carried the mug to the table and set it down in front of him. I told him he is always welcome to sit in my kitchen. He is always welcome to drink a cup of coffee. He is always welcome to seek my advice. But I drew an absolute impenetrable line in the sand. I made it entirely clear that the financial institution of his mother was permanently closed. I told him I will never again fund his life. I will never again fund his mistakes. I will never write another check to clear his debts or purchase his comfort. He traded my absolute devotion for a manufactured illusion. The penalty for that trade is total financial independence. He has to rebuild his life on his own dime. He nodded slowly. He wrapped his hands around the warm coffee mug. He did not argue. He knew the audit was final. We sat in the quiet kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was simply the sound of a new reality settling firmly into place. Some mothers fight back with tears. Some mothers scream in the driveway. Some mothers write endless letters begging for a seat at a table that was built entirely with their own money. I did not beg. I simply audited the situation, gathered the receipts, and pulled the funding. Self-worth is not something you negotiate with a cruel bride or a cowardly son. Self-worth is the baseline. Financial independence is the heavy armor that protects it. There is a catastrophic danger in underestimating a quiet mother. Arrogant people always assume silence is a symptom of weakness. They forget that the people who control the numbers never need to raise their voices. The numbers always speak for themselves. The ledger always balances in the end. This is a lesson my son learned the hard way on the side of a state highway standing next to a locked gate he could not afford to open. Thank you for joining me on Her Golden Years Stories. If this story reminded you of your own worth, hold on to that feeling, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next one.